Morning, everyone. First, I'd like to thank Neil for inviting me to speak here with you this weekend. I think when he first asked me to talk, he was hoping that I would talk in more depth about GIS and Mediterranean archaeology and about our ongoing resource at DePauw called the Mediterranean Archaeology GIS. And I'll talk a little bit about that project, but I want to talk about it in the context of teaching students about spatial literacy. I work at DePauw University, which, although it sounds like a large place, is actually primarily an undergraduate college of 2,200 students. So I spend a lot of time, my colleagues and I spend a lot of time thinking about what classics is in the liberal education, what kinds of skills and strategies and critical thinking tools we're giving to our students when we teach. So to start off with the collaboratory for GIS and Mediterranean archaeology, my colleague Peter Foss and I were looking for a way in the early 2000s to integrate our students more into our research. And the Sigma project, as we call it, CGMA, came together because we have two goals in mind. One was a research goal, which was to construct a Mediterranean-wide GIS for archaeology. Peter and I had both worked for many years in the field doing survey archaeology, and in the mid to late 90s, there was a lot of conversation amongst archaeologists about the fact that we had all these survey projects that had been done across the Mediterranean, but they had all been done independently, and there was really no way that these projects could talk to each other. The data in these projects could talk to each other. And we felt that as a first step, we needed to create, we've heard some talk about gazetteers, a gazetteer of these projects by collecting metadata and then providing that over the web through GIS. Our second goal, though, because we were at DePauw, was to provide more students with more opportunities to get involved in archaeological research, particularly because we can't take every student into the field for primary research. And so we formulated this project in collaboration, which is why it's called a collaboratory, with three other campuses, Rhodes College, Millsaps, and the College of Worcester, and our colleagues there, Kenny Morrell, Mike Doswell, Mike Galati, and Nick Cordulius. So I'm going to focus on how undergraduates were involved and can continue to be involved in the Sigma project. The way we built Sigma was actually using undergraduate students, and in order to do that, we developed an undergraduate seminar that we offered originally under the, I should say this project was originally funded by a grant from the Mellon Foundation, and components of it have now been taken over by NITELY, the National Institute for Technology and Liberal Education. And students had 4 ways to get involved with this project. We offered an undergraduate seminar each fall term that rotated amongst the 4 institutions. This was actually taught synchronously on all 4 campuses. It was not a distance learning course. We used originally the technology from the Associated Colleges of the South, their ACS course delivery system, and now we use NITELY's system to do this. And this was an upper-level seminar in which students were introduced to method and theory in Mediterranean archaeology, particularly survey archaeology, and then were taught how to use GIS. I'll talk a little bit more about the details of that. In the middle of each fall term, we held a student-faculty workshop at one of the campuses involved in the project, and this was an opportunity for students to get involved with the sort of nitty-gritty aspects of building the Mediterranean archaeology GIS. They were fully involved in discussing what fields we wanted to have in the database, how to build the database, problems, all the problems that you face when you're doing that. How do you do chronology in a database? How do you put dates in, that sort of thing. We had all these discussions with them. We also talked about how we were going to research these projects, where we were going to find them, how we were going to get the data to put into the database. The students were involved from the beginning in doing that. And students who completed the seminar were eligible for work-study grants in the spring term, and then another group of students were eligible for summer I guess you can't really see that at the very bottom of the screen, but summer student research internships. So I want to just talk a little bit about the course. This is a GIS course, and we teach it at the upper level. Like I said, Knightley has now taken over the course, and we're continuing to think about how to expand this amongst the Knightley campuses. But there are a couple of components of this course. There were lectures and exercises on method and theory and archaeology, but on each campus, the students, and there were 3 to 4 of them on each campus, had to develop their own survey project and create a GIS out of that. And so cemeteries were quite popular early on. All of our campuses happened to be located in historical cemeteries, so this is a GIS that the students at DePauw did one year, but they got more creative as the seminar went on. The Rhodes students did an Elvis GIS, because they're in Memphis, and another campus, I think this was prompted by some administrative difficulties, but they did a GIS of faculty offices in relationship to places where they have to teach on campus. And then one of my favorites, because I happen to work on ancient religion, is I prompted my students at DePauw to do what they had dubbed God in Greencastle project to look at the historical distribution of churches in our small town of 10,000, which has a disproportionate number of churches to the population. So students had to work in teams to go out, collect the data that they needed. Sometimes this involved going to the city hall and getting archival maps of the cemeteries, collecting the data, constructing their database, and then putting it into a GIS system. Students also contributed to the overall Sigma project by being assigned to specific regions of the Mediterranean for doing the bibliographic research to find the survey projects that would eventually go into the MAGIS system. And so I'll just show you a little bit about MAGIS, which is the Mediterranean Archaeology GIS. This is just a screenshot of our database. And what I want to highlight here is that almost all of this data was collected and entered by undergraduate students who were involved with the Sigma project. And this involved, of course, doing lots and lots of bibliographic research, reading through lots and lots of survey reports, and then entering the data and checking that data and making sure that it was as accurate as possible. Most of this work was done in the spring and primarily over the summer. I would also just note that DePauw has a technology internship program for undergraduates, and the database was actually, code for the database was actually written by an undergraduate student at DePauw that was primarily responsible for that. And just to give you a little taste of what we came up with, is if you go to MAGIS, which is the DePauw.edu MAGIS, you'll get something like this. You can notice that there's some problems here. One of the biggest problems that we had was actually getting accurate map coordinates for the survey regions. And some of this looks a little ridiculous to us, and I'm not sure exactly why some of these blocks are so big. One reason might be is that we did include in our bibliography projects that included large regional surveys, right? So these might be projects that surveyed monuments across a really large territory as opposed to sort of intensive field survey projects. The other problem that we found is that it turns out our colleagues are not very good at telling us where in the globe they actually were when they did their survey. And so some of this is, so some of the squares are not really the survey regions, they're just the largest extent of the coordinates we could figure out on the map that was published, which may or may not have had an actual coordinate system with the map, the published map, right? So this was all very tricky. On the other hand, if you zoom in, there's some places where we had very good coordinates, and we were actually able to draw polygons that, in fact, really reflect those territories. So MAGIS was released in 2007, and it's available, it's ongoing. One of the great things that came out of this project for DePauw was that the GIS specialist we hired through the grant has now been hired full-time at DePauw as the GIS specialist for the campus. And so while we were the first GIS project at DePauw, we now have colleagues across campus who are doing either research through the GIS Center or involving their students in GIS projects. And Beth Wilkerson is now in charge of that. So she's still, one of her responsibilities is still to maintain the MAGIS system. And I'm not going to demonstrate this here, but if anyone wants to look at it later, I'm happy to walk through it with you. But basically, we allow people to access MAGIS a couple different ways. You can do a spatial search, which is to go back to that big map and click on one of those blocks and get information that way. You can do a database search, querying specific fields in the database. We also provide KMD files so that you can download all of the MAGIS surveys into Google Earth, and then have that updated as MAGIS is updated. We also allow researchers to enter their own data about their own projects, and we encourage people to do that at this point. Our grant has now run out, so we don't have this little team of undergraduates working every summer on updating the system. So the Sigma and the course that we taught related to that is fabulous, right? We have this team of a small group of students who get exposed to archaeology and GIS, and many of those students have now gone on to graduate programs in either anthropology or computer science or archaeology. But this is a small elite group of students, and the class is very labor intensive, both from the perspective of the students, from the faculty members' perspective. It also involves a pretty high learning curve to learn how to use GIS in one semester and be able to actually complete a GIS project in that semester. And most of our students just aren't ready for that. They're not interested in it. We certainly can't teach it to a wide range of students every semester. So we've begun thinking about ways that we can start to integrate small-scale mapping projects into lower-level classes. And of course, we started this in 2002. That's a long time ago now. And the technologies that are available to us for teaching this material have changed dramatically in the last 10 years. And so what I want to move on to is sort of scaling down from a 300-level course on GIS to talking about some of the ways that we've begun to integrate spatial assignments into other classes. And what I really want to do is just to say I hope other people are doing this, or I'm very interested in what other people are doing, and that we can start to kind of work together to think about creative ways that we can teach this stuff to our students. So I'm just going to run through a couple of examples of what we've done of different sorts of uses of Google Maps and Google Earth in our classes. So this is actually something Peter did in his Hellenistic and Roman art and archaeology class. This is kind of on the micro level, the city of Ostia Antica, where he actually went in and marked all of these locations within the city of Ostia. And he coded them so that students could know which sites were referred to in their textbook, which ones were talked about in class, and then other monuments and places in the city that might be of interest. And he linked almost all of those to another web resource where there are maps and photographs of every, plans and photographs of every building. And so this was a tool to use in class, right, where the students and the professor are exploring together, just basically to explore the map. Students weren't really asked to do any actual mapping themselves with this system. In his ancient Britain class, Peter did another sort of project. The end goal in this class was that students had to present a poster at the end of the class, and that poster had to include a map on it that they had created themselves. And so as part of the class, he built in practical assignments on mapping. And so this is what he did. He created a map of one site, showing them the kinds of things that they could mark in Google Maps, and then asked them to start to create their own maps. And they had a choice between a couple different prehistoric sites in the UK, where they had to find those locations. They had to practice actually zooming in and the satellite imagery to be able to identify ancient remains from a satellite image. Mark those in some way, keying their references to the readings or other resources that are available, and basically trying to make as good use out of the tools that are available in Google Maps as possible. And I think what's most interesting to me at this point is what this tells us about what our students do and do not assume about maps, and how they think about maps and what's useful about maps. So, for example, this student was doing the area around Stonehenge, and visually the map is really pretty good. They made good use of the tools in Google Earth and being able to shade things in a certain way so you can still see the site underneath. But the links that the student provided are not so academic, as it turns out, and they could have done, in other words, they were really good on the visualization side of things. They weren't so good on the information side of things, in this case. Right, this student basically just didn't really try. They didn't name any of the markers that they put in, and they don't have any references or anything like that. It's interesting to me what this might tell us. I mean, you could just say this is a lazy student and they really just didn't try very hard. But I think it also shows us that they just assume that somehow someone else is going to get the data's there somewhere. I mean, I find that this is one of the issues that geographers are now talking about with spatial literacy, is the irony of having all of this GPS mobile map data available to us is that we're actually much lazier, or we make assumptions about the maps that may not be true. We've stopped querying those maps on our own. We just assume that someone who put the data in did it correctly and that we can follow that information. And I think this shows us that there's a big gap in what our students know, or what we think they know, or are assuming about maps. And then the last example I want to show you is something that I've done in my classes. This is an example from a Greek art and archaeology class that I taught last spring. And I've used this particular assignment a couple of times, this reading assignment a couple of times. When we get to talking about the formation of the polis in Greece, I have assigned my students this article by Catherine Morgan, which is actually it's from 1994. It's still a good article talking about the relationship between early cult activity in a region and the development of the polis. And usually when I assign this reading, I have the students write up, an analysis or a précis on the article, and then we discuss it in class. But this year I decided I would have them actually, rather than writing an analysis of the article, to make a map based on the article. And this is hard, not least because this is the map that Morgan provides in her article, right? And so, when you actually tell students, well, you've got to go find the sanctuary at Isthmia, like exactly where it is, because the topography matters here. They're like, well, how do I do that? And so we talked about how they would do that, and I'm going to skip out of the PowerPoint and just show you some results from that. So one of the things that they find out very quickly is if you search for Isthmia in Google Maps, you get modern Isthmia, right? You don't get the location of the sanctuary. And so I tell them, well, you have to go to other resources like Pleiades, and then you have to georeference that site location in Pleiades with the Google map and put the marker in the right place. And the point of this article is to talk about the relationship between all of these sanctuaries and the different, Corinth in particular, but Morgan also talks a little bit about Athens in the article. So about the early relationship between Corinth and Athens, and why the isthmus area is important in terms of sanctuaries. And so I would say that this example that I have up here is probably the best effort that a student made. She did a number of things that are interesting. She did go to Pleiades and try to find the exact locations of the sanctuaries as opposed to putting the pin, like, you know, on Google. If you just wanted to find Paracora, some of my students put the pin where it says Paracora, right?
Yeah.
But that's not where the Orion is located. So this student actually figured that out. She also created these lakes with right? Ancient Corinthians prefer a close harbor, so they picked Paracora. Well, I don't know if that's really why they picked Paracora, but at least she's trying to think about why Paracora, right? She's trying to answer that question, and she maybe didn't provide as much analysis as Morgan provides in the article, or she could have if she thought a little bit more about this. But she's thinking about it, and she's thinking about the distance between Paracora and Corinth there. Also, in this example, she's basically at the right site for ISME again. I think she used Pleiades for this. This just a little bit north of where she has all these markers, but she kind of went nuts with the use of the icons. But you know, they're keyed interestingly, right? She uses that to talk about pottery, and she brings in images that she got. I think she got them from Art Store. That's where I told her to get them from. But to talk about wealth and dedications at the same rich dedications at the sanctuary, that sort of thing. She talks about dining at the sanctuary. So this is really pretty useful. She doesn't provide a lot of external links here. One that was perhaps maybe analytically a little bit better, although not as dynamic in its use of iconography and things like that, is this one where this student has a much more figure out how to do. But anyway, she's got a much more in-depth discussion than with links outside to images and plans and things like that in Art Store. And then there's, well, I could show you examples of ones that are not so good, but we don't need to do that. They're just not so good. So I just want to conclude going back here to this. I've become over the years more and more convinced that we need to do more of this in our classes, and that classical studies, because in every aspect of classical studies, we see this here amongst all of us. I don't feel like I'm preaching to people who already do all this, but right, that we inherently are a discipline that visualizes our material, right? Whether it's archaeological material, textual material, and that there are some simple and easy ways that we can begin to scaffold these tools into our curriculum. One thing that we don't, I think, quite have yet is that there's a pretty big gap still between the kinds of tools you have available in Google Maps or Google Earth and what you have available in a full-on GIS. And there's nothing, as far as I know, someone can help me with this, there's nothing really in between if you want to do something more, move beyond the little images of drinking cups and things like that, or wine glasses on the map, to more analysis. And I'll just leave you with this quote from Diana Sinton, who works with Knightley, but also University of the Redlands and GIS. Spatial literacy is the confident and confident use of maps, mapping, and spatial thinking to address ideas, situations, and problems within daily life, society, and the world around us. And classical studies is a great place to start with.